moving a bit more into your story now.
Mm.
Um, can you just share some of your own story, what you needed to learn and unlearn as it relates to Jesus, hospitality, and compassion? What were some key moments, instances, ideas, challenges, breakthroughs along the way?
Yeah. Well, so to give a macro view, first of all, I would say that, I started doing street outreach when I was in my teens. I'm 65 now. It's almost 50 years that I've been involved at some level on the street. Um, but for a long, long time, I came unconsciously from that position of power, unconscious of my power as a white male, for instance, unconscious of my power as a person who had money and always had enough when others didn't, um, and unconscious of the inherent power of my conviction that everything I believed about God and the Bible was correct. And I had a very stringent fundamentalist theological doctrinal system that I could and did defend vociferously. And I would say before Sanctuary, this started to shift, but even through many years at Sanctuary, I would say the story of my 30 odd years at Sanctuary has been that God keeps stripping away those things that I think are um, non-negotiable or that I must have in order to be safe or secure or whatever. And that includes, I'd say the main part of that would be um, theological convictions. You know, the conviction that, for instance, going back years, that if a person put their faith in Jesus, they would be changed, maybe not immediately, but pretty quickly and pretty significantly. That's a big one. And then I discovered that some of the people that I knew over many years who had tremendous faith, the greatest faith I've ever witnessed, way deeper faith than mine, were people who never beat their addictions or never got relief for their psychiatric illness or their post-trauma issues. They never really got relief for it. And nevertheless, they lived faithful lives. So, so I think those kinds of macro things would be the biggest lesson to me, probably. Um, a subset of that would be that one of the first things that I had to learn and had to learn regularly and probably still have to keep learning over and over is I can't save anybody. There's that savior complex thing, right? I've got to remember, yeah, that's in me still. I think that if I say do the right thing and say and do it long enough, that I will be able to rescue so and so from whatever is that's going on. And it's not true. It doesn't mean that that person won't change, but if they do, it will be because God does it and because they make choices themselves. It won't be because I've said or done the right thing. And and so when you there's an ego portion to that, and ego's a two-edged sword. It kind of cuts both ways, right? So you have a big ego. Wow, if I say do the right things, this person will straighten up. And then when it doesn't happen, you're also thinking, well, I guess I didn't do the say or do the right things, and I must be a really poor person of faith, or I must not really understand what I'm doing, or I haven't tried hard enough. Is maybe the nut of it. And none of those things are true. They're just not true. So I think we have to be prepared for that. We need to be prepared for the reality that we can spend our lives working for change and see very little change. I've spent a lot of time, and other sanctuary staff people have spent a lot of time doing advocacy work around homelessness and addiction and various other issues. You know what? It's worse now than it was 30 years ago. Both of those issues and others as well. It's worse. Was it therefore a waste of time to do those things? I don't think so. I don't think so. Was it a waste of time to walk beside somebody who never beat their addictions and love them all the way into the grave? I don't think so, because that person fundamentally was no different than me. Their particular kind of brokenness or sinfulness, however you want to characterize it, was just different than mine, more crippling, deeper, less socially acceptable. Um, but I knew people like that who, if I was going to put their rate of change on a graph, I would say my dear friend Mike McEwen was a star for me, a shining star in the firmament of my own faith life. And he's been gone for a bunch of years now. But Michael was a guy who grew up in awful circumstances, battled addictions all his life, was a person of deep, deep faith, taught me more about faith than anybody else I've ever known. And I need to remember that. I need to remember him and know that his faithfulness in the face of great trial was something to behold. And it was a treasure. It was a treasure of my life to walk with Michael right to his death. And I know that my friendship was tremendously important to him too, because he allowed me to do that, welcomed me. I was with him when he got his diagnosis, and he died of liver cancer because of his addictions. And we walked through all of that stuff together. So if we go into this stuff expecting that if we're just faithful enough, God will do amazing things and will, big successes, we're not paying attention to the stories of the gospel and the acts of the apostles. Jesus died, and the disciples thought it was all over. And then he rose again. They thought, this is fabulous. And then he left them again. And they must have thought, well, this is still, it's going to be good, isn't it? And Peter preaches on Pentecost, and thousands of people come to Christ and were baptized and so on, and must have thought, wow, we're on our way, aren't we? No, they're hunted. All of the disciples except John were executed, and even John was probably tortured. So, do you not think that 30 years after Jesus died and Peter is in a jail in Rome awaiting crucifixion, that there must have been some thoughts about, did I do the right things here? What is this all about? But those men understood that was not the story that was being told here. So all the early traditions of Peter going to his crucifixion is that hundreds of people, poor people of Rome, came out to walk with him to his place of execution, and they sang hymns together. That's the story, that we live our lives together and we bless each other in doing. And we discover that the things that we protect, the marks of our privilege that we protect, are hardly worth counting against the stuff that God has for us. Mm-hmm. We really try to follow Jesus in this way. And I say try because we'll mess up. We will, all of us. Mess up.
Mhm. Yeah, that kind of um, leans into a bit of my next one. Um, how does one specifically unlearn or overcome their own kind of preconceived notions and their privilege in many ways, biases, blind spot, unconscious biases about the strangers of the church?
Proximity, I think, is the big thing. Proximity is the big deal. So um, our biases are challenged when we meet an individual who has all of the outward markers of the biases that we hold, whether it's socioeconomic or racial or whatever it might be, and we discover, oh, no, this person is more like me than different, or this person is struggling because their story is absolutely heartbreaking, and if it was my story, I'm not sure I'd even still be alive, you know, that sort of thing. So I think, again, we need to do what Jesus did and put ourselves in proximity to people who are hungry, lepers, etc., demon
Mhm.
possessed. The people that we might look at and say, don't go near those people. Those are not Christian people. I want to be near them. But Jesus did. You know, love the story about the demoniac of Gadara. Jesus gets into a boat. He's heard about this guy. Gets into a boat. The guy's not even Jewish. He lives in the Decapolis. He's a Gentile. Gets into a boat. Gets his disciples to take him all the way across the other side of the Sea of Galilee, just to meet that one guy. Goes out of his way to meet the most fearsome demon possessed person in the whole territory. You know, first thing he says to me, he asks him is, "What's your name?" The demons answer, "Legion." But I'm convinced Jesus wasn't speaking to the legion; he was speaking to the man. "What's your name?"
Mhm.
"Her name is Legion." "No, no, I'm not interested in you. Get out. Leave. I want to know your name. Who are you? Who are you?" And then there's that beautiful scene at the end of it when they come to find him. The townspeople come out, and the guy's sitting there, and somebody's giving him a robe, and he and Jesus are chatting away. And you better believe Jesus knows his name by that point. Proximity.
Mhm.
You have to find ways to be close to people. And let me say this, I think this is really critical. We've talked about soup kitchens and that sort of thing. But one of the things that's really critical, again, take this from the story of Jesus, is going where people are rather than bringing them where we are. So churches almost always were thinking, how do we get people into the church? And that's not what Jesus told us to do. He said, go into all of the world and preach the gospel. He didn't say, bring all the world into the church and preach to them there and on your turf where you have the power. Go into the world. First, receive the hospitality of others. Think of Jesus sending out his disciples. I just read this the other day. He sends out his disciples to preach, and he says, when you go into a new town, stay at the first place you come to and stay there the whole time if they'll have you. Make yourself dependent on those people, dependent on their hospitality. He's teaching them how to be humble and how to receive, as well as how to give in the context. So I think that's it, right? We go out and we get next to people without trying to change anybody. Just be with them. Eventually, we'll discover that we have things to offer as well as to receive in that circumstance. Um, and I don't know who it is in the area, in the neighborhood of Forest Brook.
Mhm.
You need to do some work to figure out who that is. But there's people who are poor or excluded one way or another. Single moms, refugees. There's probably a scattering I know, in fact, that there's a scattering of at-risk youth. Probably there's some homelessness. It might be hard to find. I'm not saying everything's about homeless people. There's all kinds of categories of people who are poor, excluded, oppressed. Um, and so go seek those people, figure out where they are. And if you can, find a way to be with them in their own environment as a learner, as a dependent one.
Mhm. What do you think are some of the common kind of deterrents from people going out and meeting those people, um, and that kind of thing? I mean, it could be, lack of knowledge of where are they. It could be something along the lines of fear and of course biases and that kind of stuff. But what would you say are some of those common determinants of why people just don't
Yeah, I think it's natural
go?
human stuff. We want to be
Yeah.
comfortable. We don't want to be threatened. We don't want to give this stuff up. This is where it comes back to that faith. If we're following Jesus, this is not something that very many of us, at least, or might be the odd person, will want to do just because we think it sounds cool to go do it. We'll go do it because we've decided this is how I'm supposed to follow Jesus, and this is where I'll find Jesus. Jesus, by the way, he says, "Go into all the world, preach the gospel, make disciples of all nations, and watch out." That's what lo means. Watch out, because I'll be with you. That's where you'll find me, out there. you know, which tallies perfectly with the Matthew 25 stuff that we've been talking about, in as much as
Mhm.
death, the least of these, my brothers. So I think it's totally natural. And let's be honest about it with ourselves. Let's say this scares me. So if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it because Jesus is calling me to do it. And by the way, I want to say that please, folks, anybody who's listening to this, don't say, well, I don't think Jesus is calling me to do it. He's called you to do it, but he's not calling me to do it. You know what? It's the teaching of the gospel. If you want to know what God is calling you to do, pay attention to the teaching of Jesus. He calls us all to do it in some fashion. And I don't know what the fashion is that he's calling you to do it in, but he is calling you to get out of your comfort zone and make yourself vulnerable and be with people you know, who are sick, hungry, lepers, you know, um, the riffraff of society, and the people who are rejects for other reasons, like the centurion and Zacchaeus and people like that. So that's what he's calling us to do, and we need to figure out how it works for me and for us as
Mhm.
communities of faith. What do we do with this? Because
Mhm.
it's what we're supposed to do, isn't it? If we're Christians, aren't we supposed to be like Jesus? So if we're gonna be like Jesus, we got to go where Jesus went, and we got to do the kinds of things that he did. So it means we'll heal the sick, we'll feed the hungry, we'll flip the tables in the temple, we'll raise the dead. Like, I don't mean that literally, but or any of those things necessarily literally, but in some fashion, that's what we'll do. And we got to figure out how's that. What does that look like in the Forest Brook neighborhood or wherever else people are.